Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. In this video we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between predestination and the sovereignty of God. And it's interesting because the term predestination has been used to run the gamut of definitions to include everything from the rain that falls on believers and unbelievers alike, and the sun that rises and sets every day over all of us, natural disasters and acts of God that come in and play a role in our environment, to everything including the salvation of sinners and the condemnation of unbelievers alike. So it's really been used to refer to everything under the sun, so to speak. And in all reality, it's kind of gotten blurred. The lines there between predestination and the sovereignty of God have gotten blurred. And it's no surprise, really, because if you actually look up in a modern dictionary, a modern English dictionary, the definition of the word predestination, you'll find that it's being used correctly in modern English, and that's really what you find, because the freedictionary.com says that the word predestination means the act of predestining or the condition of being predestined. 2, theology. The doctrine that God has foreordained all things. So it's really the doctrine that God has foreordained all things. The rain that falls to the ground, the sun that rises in the east and sets in the west, the number of hairs on your head, etc., right on down the line. And then it says especially that God has elected certain souls to eternal salvation. And as we're going to see in this study, that is actually the biblical definition of the term predestination. Every time that it's used in the Bible, it is used with reference to the salvation of believers, and we're going to see that. It appears 6 times. The Greek word prohorizo, which is always translated as predestined or predestinate, appears 6 times. And it always appears in reference to the salvation of believers. It goes on to say, the divine decree foreordaining all souls to either salvation or damnation, and this is known as double predestination. It's something we see in the works of theologians throughout the ages, ordaining or predetermining some for salvation and others for condemnation. Again, this flies in the face of Scripture, as every time the word predestinate appears in the Bible, it appears in reference to the salvation of believers and never to the condemnation of unbelievers. So as I said, the term predestinate kind of runs the gamut and is used in reference to everything that could possibly be predetermined, when in actuality that's not exactly the case. I'd like to turn over now to a book written by Jerome Zanchius. This book is called The Doctrine of Absolute Predestination, and it's really got some profound insight into these types of concepts: sovereignty of God, predestination, providence, divine decree, all that stuff. So he says on page 82 of his classic work, The Doctrine of Absolute Predestination, we come now to consider the meaning of the word predestination and how it is taken in Scripture. The verb predestinate is of Latin original and signifies in that tongue to deliberate beforehand with oneself how one shall act, and in consequence of such deliberation to constitute, foreordain, and predetermine where, when, how, and by whom anything shall be done, and to what end it shall be done. So the Greek verb prohorizo, which exactly answers to the English word predestinate and is rendered by it, signifies to resolve beforehand within oneself what to do. So he says that the definition of the Greek word prohorizo, which is always translated as predestined, means to resolve beforehand within oneself what to do, and before the thing resolved on is actually effected, to appoint it to some certain use and direct it to some determinate end. The Hebrew verb habdel has likewise much the same signification. So he's talking there about the Greek word prohorizo, which is translated as predestined or predestinate, predestination. And he says that it means to resolve within oneself beforehand what to do. And if we break this word down, so we're talking about the word the doctrines of predestination and the sovereignty of God. Predestination actually comes from the Greek word pro-horizo. Pro is our prefix pre. It simply means to do beforehand. Means to do beforehand. It's our prefix pre. So if I give you a precaution, I'm telling you beforehand. A precaution. If you're going to go outside, take an umbrella with you, it's raining. I'm telling you while we're in the house that if you go outside, you should be wise to bring an umbrella because it's raining. It's a precaution before you go out to do it. Be careful, that bridge might not hold, it might break. You're on dry land, you're about to cross over a river on a bridge, and I yell over to you, be careful, that bridge might not hold. She's a little shaky. It's a precaution, telling you before you venture out onto the bridge. So that's our pro is the Greek prefix. It's our prefix pre, means to do before. This is the diacritical mark in the Greek. The word is pro-horizo. The diacritical mark actually has the sound of an H in the English language. So the word is actually pro-horizo. Horizo actually means to bind or to limit. To bind or to limit. So if I have a dog in my backyard that's bound by a chain, I take a stake and I drive it into the ground, and I've got a 15-foot long chain, and my dog is bound by this 15-foot chain. That means he can go to the left 15 feet, he can go to the right 15 feet. He's got a 30-foot wide diameter in which he can run around, but he is bound by that 15-foot chain. He can't get outside of that circle, right? I've got the stake in the ground, he's chained up, he's bound, that's his limit. He's limited to a radius of 15 feet anywhere off that stake. So that's his limiting, that's how he's bound. So the term horizo actually means to bind or to limit. It started with this diacritical mark, which actually has a H sound, the letter H in the English language. And it's interesting that our word horizon, if you just add an N to it, H-O-R-I-Z-O-N, horizon, comes from the Greek word horizo. And what exactly is the horizon? It's that line that separates the earth and the sky. And the interesting thing is that the sun rises and sets every day over the horizon. And so when it rises, here comes the light. We enter into the light. And when it sets, we go into the darkness. So it's kind of like that line that separates the earth and the sky. And it's also the line that divides the light and the darkness. And that's what we see as we begin to study the doctrine of predestination. We begin to see that it actually has a lot to do with the division between light and darkness. And we're going to take a look in this series at all the verses, all 6 verses in which the term pro-horizo appears, and we're going to see that it has to do with a family of God, a family that God has chosen. It means to resolve within oneself what to do beforehand. It means to predetermine. So God has predetermined a family for himself. In this video, I'm just really beginning to explain the difference between the doctrine of predestination and the sovereignty of God. So we can conclude based off the definition of the word and the construction of the word that it comes from the 2 Greek words pro and horizo, meaning to bind or to limit beforehand, that God has set a boundary. And he's limited us, he's limited believers for the light. He's set a boundary and he's placed us in the light. And so that's why I say that the doctrine of predestination is reserved in its biblical usage for believers. And it always has to do, and every time that it appears, it always has to do with the salvation of believers, which is to say, putting believers in the light and molding them into the image of Christ. Zacchaeus, in the same book, The Doctrine of Absolute Predestination, goes on to say, divine preordination has for its objects all things that are created. No creature, whether rational or irrational, animate or inanimate, is exempted from its influence. All beings whatever, from the highest angel to the meanest reptile, and from the meanest reptile to the minutest atom, are the objects of God's eternal decrees and particular providence. However, the ancient fathers only make use of the word predestination as it refers to angels or men, whether good or evil, and it is used by the Apostle Paul in a more limited sense still, so as by it to mean only that branch of which it represents God's election and designation of his people to eternal life. So Zacchaeus affirms also that predestination is a term where in its biblical usage is reserved for believers walking in the light. That God has made a boundary and he's limited believers. Believers are limited to walk in the light. He's going to mold us into the image of Christ. We're predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ, and we're going to walk in the light. So we've talked a little bit about the doctrine of predestination, and as I said, this is really used nowadays, for everything. Whereas if something bad happens, someone will say, "Well, it was predestined or predetermined." Well, to be technical, in the biblical sense, theologically accurate, it would be incorrect to say that. God has ordained all that comes to pass. Now we're beginning to talk a little bit more about the sovereignty of God. So when we talk about the sovereignty of God, you could just look up in pretty much any dictionary. I've got the dictionary or the definition that comes from the Merriam-Webster dictionary here, and it says, one possessing or held to possess supreme political power or sovereignty. One that exercises supreme authority within a limited sphere and an acknowledged leader or an arbiter. So that's essentially the definition of sovereignty or sovereign in a modern English dictionary. This particular dictionary goes on to inform us that sovereign has everything to do with power. It often describes a person who has supreme power or authority, such as a king or queen. God is described as sovereign in a number of various Bible translations. In addition to describing ones who have power, the word sovereign also often describes power. To have sovereign power is to have absolute power. That is power that cannot be checked by anyone or anything. Nations and states also are sometimes described as sovereign. This means that they have power over themselves. Their government is under their control rather than under the control of an outside authority. And that the word sovereign is actually derived from Middle English souverain, or from Anglo-French souverain, from Vulgar Latin superanus. So essentially, sovereignty, or the sovereignty of God, or sovereign, we can put the ty here in parentheses. Sovereign comes from the Latin superanus. Superanus. Super meaning above. The word super simply means above. So we all know Superman. Superman he's simply above all other men. He's stronger. He can do more. Unless you've got some kryptonite laying around, he's going to be able to leap tall buildings in a single bound and do all these crazy things, go flying through the air, and he's super strong, and he's got all these wonderful characteristics that make him a superhero. So he's a hero that's above everybody else. He's a Superman in that he is above all other men. He has more capabilities. So super simply means above. Or over, above or over. He is over all other men. And we actually see right here in the second half of the word, we see the word reign, sovereignty, sovereign. When we're talking about God, we can say he's reigning over us in the heavens. We can say Christ is reigning over in our hearts. He's ruling. To reign is to rule. To reign is to rule. So God is ruling over creation. That is the textbook definition of sovereignty. He has all the power. The whole creation is under his control. He's got absolute control of all things, everything that happens here on earth. God is ruling over his creation. That is the definition of sovereignty. So that when we say the rain's falling, that we can say this is the sovereignty of God. This is happening by God's divine decree. Nothing happens on the earth except by the explicit decree of God. The wind cannot blow unless God gives the decree for the wind to blow. So absolutely everything that happens on earth happens by God's divine decree, providence, and his sovereign will. So these terms of sovereignty, divine decree, and providence, you run into these terms in the books written by the theologians throughout the ages. So I'd like to turn over. I think we should start with a quote that comes from The Sovereignty of God by Arthur Pink. I actually have this version here in Spanish. I couldn't find the English copy that I have, so we'll go with this one here, and I've got it translated into English right here for me. Now, interesting story with this book here is that one time I was attending a men's fellowship. I had gone with my dad, and it was at a Baptist church. This was like 15 years. This was a long time ago. And I walked in, he brought me, and they have food, and they had this, one of the guys was this executive chef, so he would always go way out of his way to make phenomenal food and all this stuff. And he comes out and he's telling everybody about all the dishes he's prepared and everything. And I didn't usually go to things like this. So I was kind of like looking around, seeing everybody. I walk over, I see one guy sitting down at a table, and he's got The Sovereignty of God on the table in front of him. And I looked at him, and I recognized the book, and I said, "It's a good book." And he looked down at the book. He looked up at me. Mind you, I'd never met this guy before. Looks down at the book, looks up at me, picks up the book, opens it up, and starts reading. The sovereignty of God. What do we mean by this expression? We mean the supremacy of God, the kingship of God, the godhood of God. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that God is God. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the Most High, doing according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, so that none can stay his hand or say unto him, "What doest thou?" To say that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the Almighty, the possessor of all power in heaven and earth, so that none can defeat his counsels, thwart his purpose, or resist his will. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the governor among the nations, setting up kingdoms, overthrowing empires, and determining the course of dynasties as pleaseth him best. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that he is the only potentate, the King of kings and Lord of lords. Such is the God of the Bible. And he closed the book, and he put it down, and he leaned back. And he just looked at me. And he never said a word. And I said, I like this guy. That guy's name was Roger. I haven't talked to Roger in a long time. But you always remember people like that, right? That's a true believer right there. One that can pick up that book by Arthur Pink and read that and just love that. That's sufficient right there. Read that paragraph, put it down. Bottom line, done. End of discussion, right? That's all that needs to be said. And that guy and I had a connection right there. I knew from that second that I like this guy because he's not ashamed of these things. He sees what's going on. He understands that God has complete control, because if he doesn't, then he ceases to be God. I've got another quote right here. This comes from a sermon that Charles Spurgeon preached on the providence of God. And Spurgeon says, "I believe that every particle of dust that dances in the sunbeam does not move an atom more or less than God wishes. That every particle of spray that dashes against the steamboat has its orbit, as well as the sun in the heavens. That the chaff from the hand of the winnower is steered as the stars in their courses. The creeping of an aphid over the rosebud is as much fixed as the march of the devastating pestilence. The fall of leaves from a poplar is as fully ordained as the tumbling of an avalanche. He that believes in God must believe this truth. There is no standing point between this and atheism. There is no halfway between a mighty God that worketh all things by the sovereign counsel of his own will and no God at all. A God that cannot do as he pleases, a God whose will is frustrated, is not a God and cannot be a God. I could not believe in such a God as that. So I'd like to turn over now. I've got here this book on systematic theology by Louis Berkhoff. We'll turn over to page 76 where he's talking about divine decree. So as I said, divine decree, providence of God. Spurgeon was preaching a sermon on the providence of God. And what's he talking about? He's talking about God reigning and ruling over his creation. He's saying that those particles that you see, they're around us at all points in time. Those particles of dust, we can't see them right now. I'd need a beam of light to come in through a window. And it happens every once in a while. You'll be sitting in your living room, just kind of laying back on the couch like this, and you'll see a sunbeam come through the window. And right in that sunbeam, you'll see all these particles of dust. And what Spurgeon says in his sermon on providence is that God is governing every single one of those tiny little particles. And one doesn't move not even a millimeter to the right or to the left more than what God has decreed. And that the wind can't blow and that the sun can't rise and set except by the explicit decree of God. God is reigning over everything. He's controlling everything. And everything is under his power or his domain. So these terms are known as divine decree, providence, sovereignty of God. They're all synonymous. So in Berkhoff's book on systematic theology, on page 76, under the topic of divine decree, he writes, "The divine decree is one. Though we often speak of the decrees of God in the plural, yet in its own nature the divine decree is but a single act of God. This is already suggested by the fact that the Bible speaks of it as a prothesis, a purpose or counsel. It follows also from the very nature of God. His knowledge is all immediate and simultaneous rather than successive, like ours, and his comprehension of it is always complete. And the decree that is founded on it is also a single, all-comprehensive, and simultaneous act. As an eternal and immutable decree, it could not be otherwise. There is, therefore, no series of decrees in God, but simply one comprehensive plan, embracing all that comes to pass." So we talk oftentimes about the grand scheme of things, or God's plan. We talk about the plan that God has, right? What we're talking about is the divine decree of God, that he does have a grand scheme of things and that he laid it all out. It wasn't like he didn't think like humans think in our limited capacity with our limited minds, and I'll do this and then this and then this. It was all one in his decree. He didn't decree one thing, then another, then another. He just had it, because we can't understand or even fathom the mind of God. But what Berkhoff is saying is that the divine decree of God is one. And when he planned this, he planned it all in one happening. So I know what you're probably thinking. A lot of you are probably sitting there thinking that this begs the question, well, what about sin and what about the evil in the world? If God's controlling everything and God has decreed all this that comes to pass, then what do we do with all this sin and all these things that's in such opposition to the character and the nature of God? Well, you have to understand that God did make his decrees from the beginning, and that yes, everything that happens does happen by the will of God. So that even sin, we couldn't think of probably a better instance to prove the sovereignty of God, which is to say that he's ruling and reigning over all of creation, than by going back to the fall of man, Adam's fall, when he fell in sin and broke God's law, sinning against God. So we'll turn again to this classic work, The Doctrine of Absolute Predestination, on page 46, when talking about the will of God. Jerome Zanchius says, "The deity is possessed not only of infinite knowledge, but likewise of absolute liberty of will, so that whatever he does or permits to be done, he does and permits freely and of his own good pleasure. Consequently, it is his free pleasure to permit sin, since without his permission neither men nor devils can do anything. Now, to permit is at least the same as not to hinder, though it be in our power to hinder if we please, and this permission or non-hindrance is certainly an act of the divine will. Hence, Augustine says, those things which seemingly thwart the divine will are nevertheless agreeable to it. For if God did not permit them, they could not be done. And whatever God permits, he permits freely and willingly. So Augustine's saying that even though we see some things in the world, lots of things actually, that seem to be against the character and nature of God, say killing, for instance, say rape, whatever type of sin you want to call it. It could be, a deer gets hit by a car and is lying on the side of the road suffering until it eventually dies. We would think, well, God doesn't want that. Surely God doesn't want that. But what Augustine is saying is that, yes, he actually does, because whatever he permits freely and willingly. So for one reason or other, which we may or may not ever understand, he does will for sin to exist, because if he doesn't, we'll go on to see that we have a bigger problem on our hands. So let me continue reading here. It says, if God did not permit them, they could not be done. And whatever God permits, he permits freely and willingly. So you have to understand that if God permits something, let's just say to permit something is to allow it to happen. He wouldn't allow it to happen unless he wanted it to happen. So to permit is to will. He does nothing, neither suffers anything to be done against his own will. And Luther observes that God permitted Adam to fall into sin because he willed that he should so fall. So there you have it from the pen of Jerome Zanchius in his book, The Doctrine of Absolute Predestination. He goes and delves into the topic of the fall of man, which is really a great place, because if we're going to talk about God permitting and willing sin, I think that'd be a great place to start. It's the beginning of the story of redemption. So we have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and God created them. Well, first we should begin with the devil, that God created the devil, right? And he obviously did create that devil with a capacity to sin, because the devil rebelled against God, led a rebellion, and a third of the angels in heaven fell with him in rebellion. And God cast the devil into the earth. And then God formed man from the dust of the earth and created him and blew into him and caused him to come to life, and created man and created woman out of the dust of the earth that Satan had been cast into. And he created him in the flesh, in corrupt flesh. And that flesh had a sin nature. We know that because it was in Adam's nature to sin. So Adam was made from the corrupt dust of the earth that Satan contaminated when he was cast out of heaven and cast down to the earth. And then God then formed Adam and created man and created woman. And so then he put them in these bodies of flesh that have a sin nature, or at least the capability to sin. And then there's also the tempter roaming around, and people will say that, well, God did not want Adam to sin, but we have to understand as well that we have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden. And then we have to think, like, who created the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And of course, the answer to that question is also that God created the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So we have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God giving Adam his law, saying, do not eat of the fruit of that tree. In the day that thou eatest, surely you will die. So he's told not to eat it. He's given the law. He's put in this body of flesh with a sin nature, and then a tempter comes along. What we're seeing here is that if God didn't want the existence of sin, why did he create this recipe for disaster? You see, he's put all the elements out on the table. What else is necessary for Adam to fall in sin? He's created from the corrupt dust of the earth that Satan was cast into the earth and corrupted everything when he was cast out of heaven. God then grabs that dust and forms man, breathes into him and gives him a soul, and now he's a living man, takes a rib and creates his wife and puts him in the Garden of Eden and creates this tree of the knowledge of good and evil and gives Adam his law saying, don't eat of the fruit of that tree. And then the devil comes along in the form of a serpent and goes after the weaker vessel as well, tempting them. And of course, Adam and Eve, because of their sin nature and because of all these circumstances around them, fall into sin. And we have to say, did God will for that to happen? Well, we know that Christ is the Lamb slain from before the foundation of the world, and we know that the beginning and the end is already determined, as told in Isaiah 46, 9 through 11, and a whole bunch of other places. God's counsel shall stand. He's declared the end from the beginning, and all things that come to pass. Since Christ is the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, we know that that refers to a sacrifice, that God's going to save his people from their sins. So yes, we do know that God had all of this in his plan. And as Burkhoff points out, God's divine decree is one. It's one. He didn't decree one thing and then sit around and think for a while and then decree something else and kind of figure this thing out as he goes. He had the whole thing planned. He issued his decrees, and now it's set in motion, and we're in the confines of time watching it all unfold. But God had this plan. He was not sitting up in heaven after he had made his creation and created Adam and Eve and cast the serpent down and all this stuff. And we see all these elements at play. And then the serpent comes and beguiles Adam and Eve, and they eat of the fruit of the tree. And then God doesn't respond to them by grabbing his hair and saying, I can't believe that they ate the fruit. Oh no, what am I going to do now? And his creation just starts spinning out of control, and just sin starts running rampant and just destroys his creation. And God's up in heaven just ripping his hair out of his head going, I never intended for any of this to happen. That is not the God of the Bible. In fact, that's no God at all. Certainly not my God. That is not a God that exists. So, I hope I've whet your appetite a little bit, that I've piqued your curiosity. This is just an introduction. As we move forward in this series on the sovereignty of God and predestination, we're going to dive deep into the Word of God. We're going to look at all sorts of scriptures, and we're going to see exactly what it means that God is sovereign, that he's reigning over his creation. To what extent does that really mean that God is reigning? And I believe that he's controlling absolutely everything. Absolutely everything. I believe, like Spurgeon believes, that not one particle of dust that we see in the sunbeam moves not 1 millimeter to the left or the right more than what God has decreed, and that nothing happens by chance, and that nothing happens except by the explicit decree of God. We're also going to look into what it means to be a part of the predestined family of God. We're going to dive deep into the doctrines of grace and predestination and the sovereignty of God. So I hope you'll stay tuned. We'll see you the next time, folks. Bye.